And hello everyone, that's Alex Volishnev, developer advocate at DataStax, and Cedric Lundven, Director of Developer Advocacy at DataStax, and we are very happy to greet you at DataStax Monday Learning. Let your week start in a great way. Hi Cedric.
Hello everyone, very happy to be here for week 2. So we will go on with the Docker basics. Let's dig into it.
Yes, and while we are starting, I see many registrations of new people who joined us after the beginning of the first week. So there is no big problem, there is no big deal. Don't worry, you are still fine. Just 2 words about the program we run to make every week the great. We have DataStax Monday Learning, which makes new classes regarding the most important topics for the developers from all over the world. And this week we work on Docker containers fundamentals. That's the second step of our Docker containers from basics to best practices course. We are doing, first week is done, but you still can do homework and watch the video recordings. But quiz is over, of course. This one is just started. And we have very interesting assignment this week. Then for the next week, we work with application development with Docker, because that's not like it was done before, I would say. And finally, in week 4, in the middle of October, we work on the best practices and final assignments. And that's very great to see you all. I see more and more people are joining, and that's really cool. Then, final thing to notice before we start. When we started this course, we didn't expect so much people interested because, well, Docker went live in year 2013, and since year 2015 it became more and more popular, and that's the time when I was started using that. But we got more than 1,000 of registrations, over 3.5 thousand views on YouTube.
That's great.
People from 25 countries, and more than 1,000 hours overall watch time. It's like, you know what? Money, it's all kind of secondary thing, as long as you have them, of course. But what really matters is time. And I can't say how excited I am what over 1,000 of watch time, so people trust us and watch our workshop. And that's incredible feeling. You see,
yeah, that's definitively a validation of this format. So, last week was really the first time we tried that. So it really seems that you like it. So, if we keep having you beginners with us on Mondays, we will have new topics coming after this 4 week. We have ideas, but, for now it's just secret sauce.
Yeah, no, Cedric, you can't say something about that. The point is, as far as I know at least, next, as soon as Docker learning path will be done, Cedric will start next one, and can you maybe share a little bit of what you are going to do?
Yeah, so I do have multiple ideas in the pipeline, so I do at least 2. So first would be everything you need to know about Spring. So that's for the Java community. Spring is obviously the main framework you would need to use if you're a Java developer. Everything is based on that, mostly. Newcomers are there, but definitely having Spring expertise on your resume make you very appealing for people to apply for. So very big target. Second target, is what about NoSQL? Back to basics. What is NoSQL? What is cool?
Yeah, and also to highlight what world of NoSQL is much more rich than you can imagine in the beginning, because you know what, I've seen so many times people are like, oh, NoSQL, yeah, that's Mongo.
No.
Well, yes, I would say yes, but not exactly, because it's more complex than that, and you have different solutions with different approaches. That definitely sounds very good to me. Okay, and then let's move on. But before we start, we have to... and thank you all for joining us. This picture on the right side, that's like 1,000 of people watching something together. We are spread it all over the world, but we are still doing something together. That's the reality of 21st century. Thank you so much for joining us. And that's week 2 of Docker Learning Path Docker Containers from basics to best practices, Docker fundamentals. So, we did a lot of great things last week, but something we didn't what is very important. And it's called data, and especially it's called persistent data. Very important concept to learn and understand. As container happen to be, it may disappear exactly the same way. Treat your containers preferably as they are ephemeral, and they should be expendable. That's very important.
Oh, pets versus cattle. You explained that last week. I remember that.
Yeah. So that's a very well-known DevOps joke about what's the difference between pets and cattle. Pets have names and cattle has IDs. If your pet is sick, you bring your pet to a veterinarian. If your cattle is sick, you're mostly probably going to dispose it. And containers are born to be expendable. Containers are cattle. But still, not all of our applications are stateless. In most of the cases, you are going to handle some data and you are going to keep some data available all the time. And if somehow your container was destroyed, you still want your database to be available when you just start the next one. So, we have to treat persistent data specially. And how do they do that? In general, there are two main ways. Technically, there are three ways, but third way is a temporary FS in random access memory, so we don't cover it. It's not persistent. And we speak about persistent data. First way is a bind mounts. Bind mounts is a very simple idea. It's just a way to mount a local folder into the container file system. Simple as that. You have a folder, you have some files on that, you launch a container, you specify this folder to be mounted into the container, boom, you have this folder available in both of your local machine and in container. Important to know what bind mounts the host mount precedes container. It means what if you have some data in the container on this folder, and if you have some data on your local machine and you bind a mount, boom, your data from host replaces the data in the container. And that's very convenient and that's a very good way to work, especially for developers use cases. When you type your code, you write a program, it stores it in your local folder and it immediately appears in your Docker container. It's a very convenient. Most important things to mention about that. So it allows direct access to the files from both host and container. By default, it will be read-write, but you can set it up to be read-only if you need that. It's managed by user, so it's basically just a simple folder or file mount, and not a special Docker entity you treat with Docker commands. Usually, and that's important to understand, you prefer bind mounts when data comes from your host machine and you are the developer typing commands. Okay. And file system and main things when we make a bind mount, for example, if you launch a container with a docker run command, you should remember from previous week, we can specify -v, so for volume, local path, double point, container path. And if you want to change mode of access, set it to read-only, it's going to be local path, double point, container path, double point, RO for read-only. Notice what by the local path, I mean absolute path, not relative one. If you are trying to use a relative path, when Docker will think of your local path as of a volume name, and we are covering volumes on the next slide, so it will not work. And if you don't want to specify the full path like home, username, project name, blah, 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 then you can use a Linux abbreviation of $pvd in parentheses, which stays for the current directory. Simply give me the current directory, as you see on the screen on the example 3. And there is a little complication which never happened before. Now Docker provides two tools or two mechanisms two ways to attach volumes and bind mounts. In first case, you can use minus minus volume or minus V, and in a second way, you can use minus minus mount. And they recommend now to use dash dash mount way and specify type bind.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was something new for me as well, because volume command argument or option is much more well known and was available from the very beginning, but now it's not recommended way anymore. Not like it's deprecated, it's not deprecated, but it feels like it's going to be deprecated in some next years. So maybe if you are just starting, you better start to use dash dash mount instead of dash V, because just you use it for that from the very beginning. And when you have to specify, I have my pointer. First, you have to specify type, and type will be bind. Then you have to specify source, and source will be local folder. So in this case, just local folder I am located in. Otherwise, you may add slash and whatever path from current folder if you want to mount a subfolder. And finally, target is just a path on the container. So it's exactly like it is with minus V, but you have to specify type bound. There are two ways. If you're already using dash V, it's fine, it's not yet deprecated. Maybe it will not be deprecated, I don't know. But with dash dash mount is the new recommended way to mount things. And when we go from the container, this folder is mounted to the file system you are working with. When we speak about volumes, and volumes is more new, although still not for last year improvement, let's say another way to handle the data. Notice there is no principal difference. It still will be folder to folder mounting. But Docker volumes are the entities managed by Docker. So you may say Docker volume list, ls, Docker volume create, Docker volume delete. And it's managed via Docker commands. And the folder you are working with, the volume you are working with, will be a folder on your laptop, but it will be located here in the Docker zone. You don't usually work directly, although it's still possible. It's a very often use case for the situations when data is created by a container. What does that mean, created by a container? For example, imagine your database running in container, and you are storing an insert statement, and your data in the database will be stored finally on disk because, well, database wants to persist its data. And in this case, although it's initiated still by you, but anyway, data is managed and created by the database. So usually when you work with database, you prefer to use volumes. And there is exactly the opposite way. When you mount a bind, when you do a bind mount, then it means what you have some data in your folder, it will overwrite the data what exists in the container on the target path. For the volumes, it works a bit opposite way. When you create a new volume, and create a new volume, that's important, and the target path in container is already filled with some data, with some files, those files will be copied to this newly created volume. It may be not so easy to catch like from the very beginning, but you start to practice that, you will get into the idea what do I mean. Very good. And we prefer volumes for the cases when data comes from a container, like databases, but not only databases. Good. Typical commands to work with volumes. First of all, it's a first-class Docker entity, so you have all the typical list of commands you may need. Docker volume create, Docker volume list, Docker volume inspect, Docker volume remove. Very typical, that's mostly the same list for the networks and so on and so forth. When you create or when you work with volume using Docker run command, so there are again still two the same ways, minus V or minus or via dash mount or using dash v. Using dash v or volumes. First thing, you specify volume name like this or like this, and then you specify container path. So it will be /up in my case. So volume name at project data will be mounted to target path /up on the container. And notice it looks exactly like from the bind mounts, but that's the name. And that's exactly the mistake happens when you are trying to mount the relative path, the path using relative way. So /project data. It will be interpreted as a volume name, and it will not work because you cannot use slash and dot in the volume name. You always have to use full path if you want to work with bind mounts. And another approach, which is now recommended, is to use dash mount as on the third example. So we can go with docker run dash mount source. That will be the name of the volume, and target, it will be the target path. So exactly the way to attach this volume on the container. Very good. And we just reached first demo. So let's do some very interesting things. Like how exactly the persistent data lost. We want to cover 3 scenarios. Very simple one. We will work with MySQL. So you all must be more or less experienced with this kind of relational databases at least. And first way, we work with MySQL. We don't do any mounts. We don't do any volumes. Data is lost inevitably. And for the second case, we use MySQL, but we mount. We do a bind mount, and data will be kept, and we will have it everything on the local folder. And finally, we use MySQL with volume and data kept, and we have Docker volume, but we kinda don't have local folder. I want you to know it still exists, but it's hidden inside the deeps of the Docker zone. You usually don't go. Whew. And we can start. And I need my terminal. Good.
Yeah, maybe you need to make a smaller and a bigger.
I will make a smaller definitely. Give me a moment. Boom! Now we are small.
Oh, oh, what happened?
Good. Now I'm going to clear and make it bigger so everyone will see what I'm typing. Pum, 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 pum. And
on terminal, yeah.
A little bit bigger, even I think like that.
Yes.
So very well. And now very simple example. So first of all, I'm going to switch to volumes. Good. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going just to run Docker MySQL. And let's take a look on what exactly I'm doing here. Well, Docker run. This one must be familiar to you because, well, we did that before. Now, -d. I run MySQL in the detached mode, so it will be run in background and will not block my terminal. Then, -e. I'm setting an environment variable, which is called MySQL allow empty password equals true. What happens here? The point is containerized MySQL will not simply run if you not give it a root password, because it's kind of okay, you cannot log into MySQL if you don't know the password, and if you don't give the password, you don't know the password. And to avoid this, I simply say, okay, empty password is fine. Then it means root has empty password. And that's obviously not the thing you want to have in your production environment. But for the container I'm going to destroy in a minute, that's perfectly fine. And finally, I have to specify what particular image I'm using, and that's going to be MySQL. Official MySQL image latest. And now, yeah?
Now, if you can make yet another time bigger,
okay.
Because, you know, some folks may have the screen blur. It's not due to the stream, it's due to your bandwidth at home. But if you can make a little bit bigger, or, I don't know, Can you quickly switch from black background to white background terminal?
You
I don't know if you can do it
think
fast,
it
but
will
anyway.
help? Oh, I can try. To be honest, I did it last time like ages ago.
Yeah, let's move on. I think it's big enough now.
Yeah, I think it's big enough. So, okay, and I have ID of a Docker container running. So, let's take a look what I have right now. I have my MySQL container running with ports, with a name and so on. And what I want to do now is I want to attach to this container to see what's going on and how it is inside. And I want to go for docker exec. Exec allows you to run a command on a running container within it, exactly inside. And now I go for docker exec. As I'm going to attach to it, I have to specify, as I told you last week, a -it for interactive terminal to allow me to be attached to it, not just execute command and quit immediately. And as I did it, I have to specify which particular container I'm accessing. I'm giving beginning of its ID. So it's just container ID C615 and others. I don't type it fully because there is no need. As long as this ID is unique enough, so Docker may identify one of my running containers, and that's the only one, so it's going to be easy job. It will be enough to identify the container and give it to me. And finally, I specify what I want to call a command MySQL. So once again, docker to call for the docker, exec is to execute a command within running container, execute a command interactively because I'm going to jump inside the container, container ID, and what command I'm going to use. Instead of MySQL, it can be bash, for example. So I will be attached to a container, and hooray, I'm inside the container, and I can see what's running inside. Okay, they don't have PS installed, which is a bit weird, but okay. But I can say MySQL, and boom, we are in MySQL. Oh, okay, will not help. And what I'm going to do now, first, I want to show my databases. And I have only 4. Information schema, MySQL, performance schema, and sys. All the typical MySQL databases it needs to run. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a database. Create a database, you call it test1. Boom. And I show databases again. And we see I have all those same databases as before, but also test1. And I'm going to quit, and I'm going to quit. Container still running. Now I have to recreate this running thing, and I'm going to be polite with docker stop. And process stopped. And now I want to run it again. So I go for docker run, blah, 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 the same things. And I have a new ID because I'm not restarting the previous container. Moreover, I can even remove previous container. And who knows what will happen when I will exec attach to this new one with a name 2EM55. Oh, again bash. I forgot to use MySQL. And show databases. Databases. And of course, there is no test. Very simple, because it's a new container and all the data is removed with the previous container. If you want to have your data stored somehow, you don't use this approach. I don't need these there. Yeah?
Yeah, put your mask on and come closer to me. You're again in front of the command line.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, let me switch to you so I will not hide data.
Or on top as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's fine. That will be fine. Good.
Perfect.
So, Again, no persistent data by default. You have to care of your persistent data specially. Now, just to check if I have any volumes, docker volume ls. Okay, I have some volumes. Oh, those are leftovers from my previous experiments. I will wipe them out for the cleanup purposes, to have everything clean. Docker volume rem.
Oh, Docker volume prune. I think can do that.
Oh yes, you see, prune happened to be after I started to use Docker, and old doc is not so easy to learn new tricks. So yes, you are right. You are right. Docker prune is much better way. Never mind. Let's go on. You see how great to have it next to me?
Yeah, no, so close.
Yeah. Regarding cleanup and Docker prune, we will speak at the best practices part, so week 4. Good. What comes next? We have second thing we will do bind mount. So I'm going to copy my command and show it to you. And this one is a little bit longer, but idea is the same, and most of them you've seen already. Docker run detached set environment variable MySQL allow empty password equals true, so MySQL will be running. And then here the magic comes, -v. So we specify the bind volume from the local folder MySQL data to var lib MySQL. Oops. Sorry. And finally, I'm calling an image MySQL, so it will create container based on this image. Okay. So we have docker ps container running. When we have list of the folders, this folder was just created, so I didn't have this folder before. And this folder is also mounted to the running container. So if I do docker inspect 941, I have this long list of things related to my container, and we also have here mounts explained. Mounts type bind source, so that's my folder, destination read write true. That's important. And so as you see, I have this folder, and moreover, it's not an empty, although it didn't exist. Why? Before MySQL has started, notice it an empty empty MySQL folder and initialized it as a new database. So all the files now exist here and there, both. But if I say docker volume list, let me check, docker volume inspect CF546. Oops, where is the mistake? Volume name CF546. Okay, I will use a full name. Okay, so that's another volume from another container I'm running. So as you see, that's an old one. That's not what created, because volume was not created. That's a bind mount, which doesn't create a volume entity, and Docker doesn't care about that. It's just a direct bind mount. And as you guess, now I can docker ps and I can jump to my container like before, docker exec, but I have to specify then, first of all, I want to jump directly to MySQL, and I want to specify the new ID, and so 941, boom. And we are in MySQL. So show databases. Nothing new. Create database. Let's say test2. and show databases again. And we have test2 here. And now you know what I'm going to do right now? I'm going to terminate this MySQL completely.
All right.
So I will Docker stop it to give it 1 second to say goodbye to this cruel world. And when I'm going to completely remove it, 941, and boom, there is no this container. It doesn't exist. It's not running. It's not even stopped. This like 2EE container downwards is the one which was stopped before 6 minutes ago, exited 5 minutes ago. But my new one is completely terminated. But let's take a look what happens then. Then I run the same command again. Docker create, docker run, -d, -e, MySQL allow empty password, -v. Mounting the same and using the same image. That's a new container. It never existed before. And I'm going to jump in. And some of you may know already what will happen. 5, 4, 6. Okay, will work for me. Good. And I say show databases. And my database test2 is here. So I have my local folder and I have my data. And final thing, I can, instead of creating a database with my bind mount, because I don't need this folder. For example, I may want to have my folder under Git, and I don't want my local MySQL data to be stored under Git and deliver it to, I don't know, production or GitHub or anything. Of course, that's my local data. So in this case, I prefer another way. So one last command, docker run -d, the same password thing, -v. Now name it volume, MySQL data, mounted to var lib MySQL. And now when I say docker volume ls, I have this new one, which has name MySQL data, which has driver local, and that's my volume available for me. Let's inspect that. Docker volume inspect and MySQL data. Boom. And we see when it was created, driver local, no labels, mount points, and some other things like name and possible options and scope. Now, interesting point. This folder, it's a real folder on a real machine. But as I'm using MacBook doesn't support natively Docker, so it's still a virtual machine inside to run Linux commands using X-Hive virtualization.
Oh.
And if I try to go to this folder, I will find nothing. Because first, I have to attach to this virtual machine, which was easier back in the days. Docker for Mac was using VirtualBox, but well, it's not here anymore. And that's for good. For real, I'll tell ya, Docker for Mac improved so significantly over years. That's just great. So, but if you are a user of a Linux, when you can go to this path and see this folder with your MySQL data within your host machine. So that's important to know. Volumes are no principal difference to bind mounts. It's still a folder with files. Like, you know, there is no cloud. That's just someone else's computer. The idea is exactly the same. But now, yes, when we say docker volume inspect, docker volume delete, docker volume rm, then Docker can manage those entities, and that's great. And I don't want to waste your time for running these commands for this container. I hope you trust me. What if we will create a database?
I do trust you.
Yeah, thank you. But maybe there are some not so... Oops. Show databases. Okay. But if there is something, create database test3, we have this database created, and we are going to kill this container. Docker kill, oh, what was its name? Docker ps. Docker kill. I'm going actually to kill both. 5, 4, 6. Boom. Is not running. Okay. Never mind. Okay, so it was stopped already. Very well. Okay. And I will wipe them all out. Ooh. So I have no containers anymore. And finally, I'm going to run a new one using the same volume. So docker run -d -e. I hope you can see the command behind us. Okay, I will raise it a little bit higher. So I'm using the same volume MySQL data. And it means what I can attach to my previous one. It will be 8D10. Yes, and show databases. And test3 database is of course there, because volume was not deleted despite container was deleted. So volumes and containers are two different entities, and you have to think of both of them. So I think we did enough regarding those simple things. Anyway, you have to do those exercises on your own to get it all in your blood and in your memory, and to persist this skill. And I want to move to the next part. Cedric, maybe we have some questions to answer?
Simply one question just popped up. How you calling Docker by ID, I think?
That's a good question. That's a good question. So answer is very simple. The point is,
you do have an alias.
Exactly. I'm a very lazy developer, so I have an alias. That's very easy to explain. Then we go, for example, to nano bash profile. You will see a long list of different setups I'm having right now.
Yes.
Yes, and Docker Compose is here. And it's defined just like Docker Compose as DC and Docker as D, because, well, I'm very lazy. Good. Yeah, aliases. You see, when you work actively with terminal, you do need a lot of aliases if you want to be efficient. And I have one more question. How to set up Git with Docker? Do I have initiate the Git first, then run the container? Mohammed, we cover it in the week 3, but in general, Docker and Git doesn't communicate directly to each other in any way. So you can have both and just run Git commands, and Docker commands, they do not interact anyhow.
Oh, the question, what's the difference between bind and volume? Maybe you should review just review the streaming, because this is exactly what we explained 15 minutes ago.
Yeah, exactly. So I will not explain it again, because we have more topics to cover, some exciting topics. But what's important to remember here, we have two main mechanisms: bind volumes and bind mounts, and data volumes. They're very close, except of some differences, and I suggest you to walk through the video again or slides to get the difference better. And first of all, do it on your own using the homework assignments. Good. And we can move on. Now, multiple containers. All what we did before, we did some containers running one by one. We had running Nginx, we had running MySQL, we had running some, I don't know, Ubuntu, but it never was like something really operational or bringing some value, like just an Nginx serving a static index HTML. Well, it may have some purpose, But in general, usually when we speak about the software systems, we speak about multiple components and the art of bringing them together. And that's, I don't know if I should say it's easy with Docker or not. And there is a little trick. You will understand it in few slides. So let's move on. Multiple containers collaborate directly as long as they are in the same network. And they work natively very easy. So using a default network type bridge, containers may communicate with each other, and containers may communicate with host machine and internet. There are some network basics to learn, but I will be very brief on that. There are three main types of network in Docker. There are more of them. First of all, that's important. Those are main. If I will tell you everything about every one of them, we will finish this day like 10 hours later. Networking in Docker is a complicated thing, and there are a lot of powerful plugins. For example, the motto of Docker from the very beginning: batteries are included but swappable. It means what you can easily set up your own, you can write your own network management system, and you can write your own network plugin. And some people did that because overlay network, which allows two Docker containers from multiple servers and multiple different hosts to contact each other, was introduced, well, relatively later. And it was a big problem. If you want to contact multiple containers from multiple machines, you are in big troubles. And there were some network plugins to do that. Now they aren't in so high need because overlay network allow you to contact multiple containers from different running machines. So, easiest thing to explain is the host. Host network is basically not a network at all, but containers started in your host machine will be directly attached to the port of your host machine, and there are no networks. Whatever comes to your port of your host machine or your server or your laptop will be immediately received by the container. Host mode allows you to exclude all the network expenses. So when you use any kind of software-defined networks, like Docker networks, it works usually very quickly, more or less, but there are still some possible delays. And if you want your Docker infrastructure to be as efficient as possible, you maybe want to exclude any kind of a network and attach directly using host-type network, which is not exactly a network per se. Downsides, it's only supported by Linux, and as long as one of your containers took port 5000, for example, it will not be available for other containers running on the same machine because it's a host container for 5000. So one port to be used only by one container, obviously. That's kind of some extreme situation, and well, mostly probably it's not for developers. So now I'm sorry I added this network type at all to this slide. But now you know more, which is great. So now the main type of network, which is used by default, which allows only connection within single host and provides very nice DNS features, is a bridge type. So every container attached to default bridge, which is created when you start Docker first time, can communicate with other containers only using their IP addresses, which is not going to be convenient because obviously containers are expandable, so you're going to have new IP addresses over time very quickly. User-defined bridge will have a real DNS service within, so your containers may communicate using their names. So when you call a container, when you create a container and give it a name MySQL, then all the other containers will be able to reach one using the name MySQL. Simple as that. And that's great. So bridge is the default one, covering all the communication within container to container, container to host, container to the internet via network address translation, and all the things like that. One downside, it's only supports single host. So all your container on your laptop will be able to communicate, but we will be not directly able to reach containers only on another running machine. Well, only except of a situation you run dedicated bridge there again, and then you set it up like very remote computers, so a lot of work. And finally, overlay is a network to communicate over multiple hosts. Usually it's not used so much, at least by developers, and usually it's not used with plain Docker, but it's more speaking about Docker Swarm, which we will briefly discuss in some next weeks. When working with networks is very similar to working with volumes. You can list them, you can create network specifying type, you may inspect a network, you can delete network, and you can connect a running container to existing network. Docker network connect network container. And I told in the beginning what I can't really say what running multiple containers is easy. And now you will see why. Because we are getting very close to live demo 2, and we are going to create network driver using driver bridge. So it will be user-defined bridge network to enable ADNS settings on that. And then I have to run first container, and then I have to run second container, and I'm not sure about your definition of a word easy, but that doesn't exactly fit into my definition of word easy.
You made me, you made me faster just to install that stuff.
Yeah, maybe it will be easier to install MySQL requirements, install PHP, and then run WordPress. So what we are going to do now is we are going to run WordPress. And WordPress requires PHP and many of other different dependencies, like some PHP extensions. And of course, we have to store data somewhere, exactly speaking, MySQL. And now, setup for this demo is a little bit more complicated. By stay tuned, I told you Docker is awesome, so just trust me and don't quit for next few minutes, and you will see what I mean. But now, let's walk through things what going to happen right now. First, I'm doing Docker. First I'm doing Docker network create. I'm giving the name to my network, and I'm specifying driver bridge. To be honest, driver bridge is default driver type, default network type. So I may skip completely this part and just type Docker network create WP, just the name of a network. And it will still give me the same result, but I use driver bridge just to be more clear. Then, second point, I'm going to run MySQL. And now, notice, very important what I run it as a second step, because on the startup of the WordPress, it will try to connect to a database. And if I start Docker WordPress first, it will fail because, well, we don't have MySQL available. So we go Docker run, detach, background, mount volume, name it volume MySQL data. So because we are going to have this data persistent, to be mapped to var lib MySQL in MySQL container. It will use network WP, that's important. If you don't specify a network, it will be connected to a default network and therefore have no connection to a second container, because this one, well, is connected to my custom network. Name of the container will be database, and this is important. That's not just a name to easier find your container in the lists of a container you get with Docker PS. But it's also important because it will be a DNS name for this container, so WordPress will be able to find that. I show you in a moment. Then, next few -e, 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 and -e are to define required environment variables. What for? I have to specify MySQL root password to be secret password. I have to specify I'm going to use MySQL database WordPress. I will say what MySQL user is WordPress and my MySQL password is WordPress. I have to specify all of that, otherwise MySQL will not start. Well, at least I definitely have to specify secret password, and I have to specify with3 database user and password for WordPress, which starts in a second. And finally, I run publishing port 8080 left for the container. Oh, sorry, left for the host, right for the container. Publishing port 80. Mounting volume WordPress data into var www HTML for a simple purpose. Via WordPress administration panel, I can install plugins, I can install and change themes. So also WordPress has some files to store, not only MySQL, but WordPress as well. As I am not going to directly communicate with them, only via WordPress administration panel, I'm using not bind mount, but volume. When I specify network to attach, which is WordPress, I'm specifying it to be detached again to not grab my console. Then long list of environment variables, because WordPress needs some configuration as well. WordPress DB host. It will be database 3306. So 3306 is the port, we all know. But what's the database? As said, name database in the network WP will be registered as the DNS name for this container, so everyone can access it simply as a database. If I would call that MySQL WordPress database, when I have to specify here again MySQL WordPress database, it will be available. Then I'm giving WordPress DB user WordPress as here, WordPress DB password WordPress as here, and database name WordPress as here. So we are matching configuration. And well, yes, I know it's a little bit too much, but let's see if it works in general. I will need my this one. I will need this one. And we go to my terminal. I hope it's still big enough.
For me, it is.
Great. And so first I'm creating. Oh, okay, of course. I create. So few basics about networking. Docker network ls. And okay, I have some networks as you see. And here is the network I created. To keep it fair to you, I'm going to remove this one. So it's removed. And I'm going to create it. So it's created. And now I can say Docker network inspect WP. Boom. And I will move myself again to the side, so I will not hide a configuration. Hello, Cedric. Good. So here what?
Oh, you're back.
Yeah, I'm back. Yep. So we need some kind of a virtual masks, but good. And we see what Docker Network Inspect gives us: name, ID, created, scope, and so on and so forth. Other settings, and we have some settings for this network as well. Is it internal? No, it's not internal, so it's available from host. And well, it's just a plain simple bridge network. Very simple. Now, what I need to run my Docker commands. And well, yeah, that's going to take a moment. First, I want to clear that. Oops.
That's funny. People complain that commands become longer and longer.
Wait a second. I told you, trust me, I'm an engineer. Stay with me for some minutes. I will show you something you will like.
Yeah, if it was that difficult, lazy as you are, no.
Yeah. If it would be difficult, I would not recommend it to you. And what I'm doing, I'm not just recommending, I'm running a full course. It means what, well, it deserves some of your attention. And final thing for me to copy paste, MySQL 5. So it's going to be MySQL 5. I hope I did no mistakes when you start to work with commands like that. It may take some time. And now I want to check logs. to assure my Docker is running, because my MySQL container is running, because if it's not running, WordPress may fail to start. And I'm saying Docker logs. I ask to follow container minus dash F, and I'm saying C94. And my container is running, and MySQLD is ready for connections. Perfect. Now I can start my dear WordPress. And boom, 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 boom. So let me clear it. I'm preparing to start that. Good. And finally, WordPress latest. WordPress, boom, latest. I hope I did no mistake. At least it started. Now, who may tell me what's the command to watch the logs? Not you, Cedric. Not you. Docker logs minus.
I'm quiet. I'm quiet.
F.
Yeah, homework from last week.
Yeah. Good. And as you see, it's just started. And it mounted to port 80. And there is no mistakes. Otherwise, it would write me something about that. So what I can do, I can go to my local host and open that and take a look what happens next. Yeah! My WordPress is running.
Great.
And I can go on and I can set some site title, 100, 500. Username will be Alex.
Yeah. Now you need to use WordPress and you are in trouble.
Well, WordPress is not so bad. Although, yes, personally, I wouldn't use that. And I need some email.
No, it's a very, very great solution, but it's huge.
Yeah, and I don't want to index that anyway. No one can see it. And Alex, 100, 500, and we are done. So we can jump into MySQL and see what database is initialized. But we see it anyway because we can simply go here, visit site, and that's my WordPress. Hello world. WordPress is running, and all I did is just run 3 tiny commands. Looks good. I am very fine. But well, not really. Because with all of that, I have one question. Our statement, I'm too lazy to type all those commands. Seriously, that makes no sense, that's not transparent and very error prone. Is there anything to simplify our life? Answer is yes. An answer called Docker Compose. Docker Compose is the very powerful tool based on a very simple idea, infrastructure as a code. When we speak of infrastructure as a code, we usually speak of things like Terraform or CloudFormation or, I don't know, Cloud Manager from Google Compute Platform. But the general idea is the same. You describe the things you need in the configuration file and you receive the results. Instead of typing commands on my own all day or copy-pasting them from the documentation, I simply take a very another approach. I describe everything in the Docker configuration file, Docker Compose configuration file, and let Docker Compose take care of all the required actions. Technically speaking, Docker Compose is a simple Python script. Well, not so simple as it was before 5 years ago already, but it's just a Python-based wrapper which reads your configuration file and executes proper Docker console commands. And it looks like that. That's a simple file. I will again move myself back to not hide the file from you. Goodbye, Cedric. Oops.
Goodbye. See you soon.
Yeah. Good. And very simple as that. That's the file. You describe what you want to have, and we will do it in a moment. and you receive what you want. And as it's a simple plain file, you can put it to Git. Your colleagues may work with it, put some changes, and so on and so forth. Everything what I did right now is technically being executed with a simple command like that. Docker compose up. That's it. All the commands I run, just all the characters, I don't know how long it was. It was too long. Now it's just Docker compose up, and I really like this thing. So let's take a look at the Docker compose file. Or I would better switch to my code, and we will go to WordPress, Docker compose, and I will make it a little bit bigger. Oops. Hey. One more time. Yeah, that's something already. Good. So that's a very typical Docker compose file for the simple 2 services, 2 containers setup. First line, it's very recommended to have, is to define Docker compose config version. Docker compose evolved very quickly over years, and as a result, there are some strong collisions in different versions of configurations. And version 2 will behave very differently to version 3 config. So you do want to specify the version. The latest one, as far as I remember, is 3.8. And if you are only starting to use Docker compose, I do recommend you to stick to the most up-to-date version. Then I define volumes I may need for this kind of service. We are going to use them later. Before, you may omit them completely, and Docker compose would simply create them. But they getting stronger and more demanding over time, so we have now to specify explicitly volumes we are going to use. But you know what? That's for good. That allows you to avoid any kind of mistakes or typos you may have in your configuration file. So that's very recommended to have volumes and versions requiring them. When we specify services, this one is WordPress and this one is database. What does that matter? That's exactly the -- name we used before. So this one will give the name database to the running container, and this one will give WordPress name to the running WordPress container, therefore. And as Docker compose takes care of network as well, the special user-defined bridge network will be created for you, so you don't have to care of the networks after all, and let Docker compose take care of it. So those containers will be able to communicate with each other. When, as before, I'm specifying image, so which image I'm going to use. In this case, I'm going to use WordPress version 5.5.1, having PHP version 7.3. That's official WordPress image based on PHP image. Then I'm specifying volumes. One is WordPress data I just created here in the configuration and where it's going to be mounted. Notice that's the named volume, not a bind mount. Then directive depends on. Do you remember I told you I have to first start MySQL, when wait, when let when start WordPress. Exactly to avoid these kind of collisions, I specify here what depends on database. So it means this container will not be started as long as this container is not started yet. That sounds great. There is one very serious downside. Basically, maybe now it's a bit better, but a couple of years before, there were no health checks at all, and only think of a running container is what it's running from the Docker point of view. Although MySQL takes some time to start by itself, like initialized empty databases and so on and so forth. For this kind of health checks, you may need more specialized tests and scripts we cover at the application development with Docker week 3, so next week. Then we are publishing ports, so my WordPress will be available on host port 8000. When I saying restart on failure, so I want my container to be restarted if it exited with exit code not 0, so it's failed somehow. And when I'm specifying some environment variables, as I did in Docker run commands. And some of you may say, I don't like to have passwords in plaintext in the files which may be under Git, and that's very makes sense, and that's again a teaser for week 3 I want you to see next week. Because I don't like it as well, but shouldn't be like that. And finally, exactly the same directives for the database. We will have a service called a database with the image MySQL 5.7, with the volumes MySQL data, restart on failure, and with the environment variables to be set like that. And that's all my file and how it works in the end. First of all, let me remove my old containers because I don't want my laptop to be over busy. It will be docker ps. Oh, I have a bunch of them. How come? One was restarted, I guess. Doesn't matter. So docker kill 8b9 c94 8d1. I can, as you see, can mention multiple containers at one. And a little bit of cleanup, and we are good to go. So I'm going to switch to my WordPress folder, and first thing I'm going to do, docker compose ps. And docker compose tells me, oh, okay, as always. I guess, Cedric, I will stay with you for the rest of the workshop, otherwise I'm jumping here and back all the time.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Good. So, and docker compose says me I have nothing. Now I can simply say docker compose up, enter. And docker compose does a lot of interesting things. First, it create network, not so fast, it create network WordPress default with a default driver, which is bridge. Then it creates required volumes with a default driver, which is local. Then it creates WordPress database and WordPress for us. And now a little explanation. Here, this part, database, is the name of the container we defined in the configuration file, both the database and WordPress. When number 1, we need it when we start to scale up, and I will show you again in a moment. And finally, this WordPress, where does it come from? Very simple. You may have multiple Docker Compose projects in different folders, and you may run them at once. To avoid the collisions, if you don't explicitly specify a name for the Docker project, it will use the name of the folder you allocated. So this WordPress database 1 and WordPress 1 are coming all from here, because last folder I am located in is WordPress. If you don't specify Docker Compose project name, it will use folder as a project name by default. And now we see some logs. I started Docker Compose without -d, without detached mode. So I'm receiving all the logs to my console, and we see some good things happen. First of all, MySQL is ready to accept connections. And second of all, my WordPress is running. And now one more thing to notice. I've used port 8000 for WordPress. I don't know why I did that, but okay, let it be 8000. So now I can go to my browser. Just localhost port 80 will not be available anymore as we stopped previous WordPress. But if I go now to 8000, I have my WordPress install here available. Isn't that great? And you can run it completely on your own, given you have this Docker Learning Path repository, github.com DataStax devs Docker Learning Path, and we have here week 2, and we have here WordPress. And just compare this gorgeousness, all the things you have to do to run containers on your own, and that's only 2 containers. But for some applications, for example, in my past experience, I had like around 40 containers running. It's not convenient to manage them without Docker Compose. And with Docker Compose, it's Docker Compose up -d and have this configuration file explaining your setup. I love that. Good. So, this one is running and I want to stop it. And I want to start it again, but with -d command. Now we have to cover some things, important things. Docker Compose has multiple commands for you to realize. And walking through the commands, you must learn following commands. There are more of them, but we are speaking about the essentials and fundamentals. So, Docker Compose up will launch your application, and Docker Compose down will take it down and clean up. So if I say Docker Compose down, it will not only stop the containers, but also wipe up the volumes, and it will also wipe up the networks, things like that. Good, but I want to have it running. It will take some time to run it again, but we can discuss commands meanwhile. Docker Compose build. We will do it in a moment, but in general you have to know, in my Docker Compose YAML file, I've used only images. So if we take a look here, I'm using image, and I'm using image. Just to run some application and see how it goes, it's perfectly fine. But when you are developing, it will be not convenient to pull an image or build it locally with Docker build and then use it here and so on and so forth. So to avoid things like that, instead of following the image directive, you can use build directive and specify the address. Like imagine I'm working with application located in the app folder. And therefore, instead of pulling image of WordPress for me, like let's say I'm developing WordPress. God bless me, I don't. But yeah, I would not do that. But let's imagine I was punished for something, and we have this build directive, and I'm developing WordPress in this folder. And when I can say Docker Compose build, to have the image to be used by Docker Compose. But in this case, I want to stick to image. Anyway, I don't have an app folder at all. Following commands I have to cover. Docker Compose logs and possible options -f and container. How it works? Very simple way. I have my application running. I can say Docker Compose logs and ask for all logs. Docker Compose prints all the existing logs and quits. But in some cases you want to trace what's going inside the system. And then you say Docker Compose logs -f, which stands for follow, -f, follow, and it will not quit. As soon as I start to use this WordPress, I will have logs right here. And finally, if I specify the container name, like if you have 40 containers but you want to debug one, you have to specify this one to avoid all the logs from all over containers. And then you can simply say WordPress. And boom, I have logs only from WordPress. What's next? Docker Compose exec. You already know Docker Compose exec, Docker exec, but just as a Docker exec. With Docker exec, you have to type Docker, container ID, exec, -t, command to execute, and so on. Docker Compose makes it a little bit easier. So I simply say Docker Compose, or if you are lazy like me, you can set up some aliases and use the DC. But well, that's a workshop, so I have to stay strong and use full names. Docker Compose. I can say exec. I can give container name, WordPress, and I can say what exactly I'm going to do. I will need bash. And in this case, I don't have to specify -it, because thanks to Docker Compose, interactive terminal will be allocated automatically. And boom, I'm inside the Docker container, so I may say ps-aux, and I have all the processes running here, so you may take a look. And we have what's going on inside. We have Apache web server running. We have so Apache processes www data, and we have bash because I'm logged in into the container, and we have ps-aux because that's the command I'm executing to see what's going on within the container. I may ask, who am I? I'm going to be root, and I can take a look at what's the folder. And if you have experience with WordPress, you maybe will recognize all those files, because basically that's my WordPress is. And I may, I don't know, change something in index.html. Okay, I have no nano, maybe v. No, maybe vim. Okay, I will not change this file. Never mind, never tried to do it before. Good. So that's my WordPress, and that's it runs. What's next? I have to specify for you to know. Docker Compose stop and Docker Compose start. Those will stop containers and start containers pretty obviously, and it will not delete them. So if you store something within the containers, even without using persistent data, it will be stored, but in general that's dangerous approach, so I recommend not to do that. But the point is, workday is over, you want to go home, you don't want your laptop to be busy with the things, and you can say Docker Compose stop, and containers will be stopped, and it will be a little bit faster to start and stop than the full recreation cycle you maybe need in some cases. So stop and start. The same way I can specify which container to start, so I can simply specify Docker start MySQL if I don't need WordPress. Again, in this case, that's not so big deal, but when you have a dozen of containers running, you may want to manage resources. No such service MySQL. Why? Oh, because it's a database. Oops. Database. Exactly. Okay, Docker Compose stop. And do I have anything else here to mention? Restart. I will not show you. You got to this YouTube stream. It means what you can't handle things like Docker Compose restart on your own. And Docker Compose kill is exactly the same like stop, but without graceful termination time. It just sends sick kill immediately, so it just works quicker. But be careful, because if you work with persistent data on your production, you don't want to use kill. And Docker Compose down. That's I've shown you before. That's to clean up and wipe out things what were used before. So you say Docker Compose down, it will delete network, it will delete containers, etc. Now, one big thing about the Docker Compose. You have to remember, Docker Compose is the thing which is not perfectly designed to run on production. So if you have small amount of containers running on production, you may want to avoid Docker Compose at all and manage it with, I don't know, manually or with Ansible or something. If you have many of them, you may need Kubernetes, which is not a part of this course. And in general, it's recommended to avoid using Docker Compose in production. So it evolves over time, and maybe it's already reached a point. I promise you to make an investigation about using Docker Compose in production, but we will see if it works or not. And we are very close to the time we are done, and we have to do a quiz. But before that, I want to show you one last thing using our Docker playground. So we have labs, play with Docker thing. Some of you have used that already. It's a cloud console to use Docker. And we have here these labs play with Docker, and I'm going to add a new instance. And I'm having this new instance available. And now you may say, okay, we use it with WordPress and database, and it was great, but can we have maybe some real cool example of application you may run with things like that? And yes, I prepared something for you. And I will not run it locally because this way you will be not able to reach that, but I'm going to run it in a Docker playground, so you will be able to touch it and use it. And I'm doing git clone, and I'm cloning our DataStax devs Docker learning path. And I'm going to switch to this folder, week 2, it's week 2. And here I have a voting app. Perfect. And that's a very simple thing. No, it's not simple thing. It's a real application. It's a demo application, so it's small, but that's a seriously big and great demo application. Let me show you. Have you heard about microservices? I guess you heard. So application we are going to run now looks exactly like that. That's an application to vote, and we have voting front end where you decide to vote for punct A or punct B. It dispatched to be highly scalable and very performant. It dispatches every vote done to Redis queue, and when we have a bunch of Java workers processing this Redis queue, handling all the votes and putting the prepared results, processed results into the Postgres, and then finally we have Node JavaScript backend to show you the results. And it consists of 5 kinds of different services, and Java workers are launched in a big group. So let's take a look. I have it right here, and I'm saying exactly the thing I did before. Docker compose app-d. It creates voting app default with a default driver network. Voting app, because I told you that's the default name, project name. It pulls all the required things. And while it pulls, let's take a look on what exactly it's going to pull. That's the Docker Compose for our system. And we have here 5 services. Voting frontend on the port 5000. And it will use my image DLP voting. DLP for data for Docker learning path. We have Java worker as a DLP worker. It doesn't need any ports, but it needs connection to both Redis queue and Postgres. Result frontend to show you the results from Postgres. And it uses Postgres as a database and Redis to handle queues. And let's take a look how it goes with our Docker playground. We are almost done, so last image to be pulled. It works pretty quickly. System is pretty busy right now because it's a tiny node. But well, thanks to Play with Docker platform for giving us for free. Hey, okay, result is not downloaded yet. Voting is, Redis is, Postgres is. By the way, DLP result needs some love and needs some optimization because Docker file is not nice, and we are going to improve it at our next workshop. Next workshop for best practices. So this one is ugly, but that's for intention. So we will have something to improve.
Great.
And finally, worker. Yes, perfect. So we have Redis, we have Postgres, we have voting frontend, result, and worker, and they are running. I can check how it goes with Docker logs -f. I will follow. Sorry, I have to. I'm with Docker Compose. It's much easier. Docker Compose -f. I don't have to specify the container. Docker Compose will follow all of them. Docker Compose logs. Correct. Good, and we see what voting connected to Redis, we see what worker connected to Postgres and Redis, and we see what result is connected to Postgres. And Postgres is starting and Redis started. Great. So we have two ports open, 5000 and 5001. And we go to port 5000. And we have application starting up. Yes.
Slowly.
Slowly but surely. And we have to decide cats versus dogs. And you know, I'm completely cats person, so I definitely going to vote for cats. And vote is processed by 4614 whatever. It's a container ID, and vote is dispatched to Redis, pulled by worker, processed by worker, pushed to Postgres, and shown by the result up 100% of votes for cats. But you know what? I'm going to copy paste these to you on YouTube. And maybe even Discord. And you can go there and vote. I actually ask you, okay, we see it's changing right now. So we have cats and dogs, and there are some changes. And okay, dogs are winning, but that's fine. I love you. Whatever you prefer, cats or dogs, that doesn't matter to me. Very well. Application is running. We have a lot of votes. By the way, you can change your vote if you want. So I'm revoting to dogs, and I guess it changes a little bit. But well, you know, I will stay honest. I will stay with cats. And result is changing back. And now, please stop voting. I know you like that. But let's get back to me. Just final few things you will really like. So take a look. We see the logs right here. Application is running. People from different countries are voting for cats or for dogs, whatever they prefer. But now I want you to show something extra special. So how many our services we have running, like we developed? 3: voting, worker, and result. We have 2 more databases. And I told you it's microservices scalable thing. So take a look on what I'm doing right now. I'm giving you here Docker Compose, scale. I take worker, I set worker count equals 3. And now it starts to look really like this picture. Where was it? Here. Because now we have 3 Java workers processing your requests. And if we see it here, we see up worker 1, worker 2, worker 3 are created and available. And now we say Docker Compose logs -f worker. To simplify it, I will follow only the worker logs. And we see what worker 2 connected to a DB and worker 3 is connected to a DB. And now you can go and change your vote a couple of times. And you will see how multiple containers, multiple workers, multiple processors process your votes automatically. And we can tell Docker Compose PS, and we will see many processes running and available because we have Postgres, Redis, result, voting, and 3 workers are available for us. And that's damn amazing. So this week assignment. Let's do a more complex setup using Docker Compose. It should include at least one predefined image, like MySQL, and a custom image you build. You should persist data, so Docker Compose down will not wipe it out. Please use our week 2 samples for the inspiration. To make it simpler, last workshop's assignment was to Dockerize something, and I really don't want to give you any particular suggestions, because that should be Docker should be suitable for what you doing, not I doing. And this way is the same. I want you to have a running simple application like we had with WordPress and MySQL, but a full stack application with a database and application as it is. And with our voting app, we had pretty complicated already system. We've scaled out workers, front end for voting, front end for results, and so on. So that was a pretty big one. And I want you to use Docker Compose with one at least predefined image. Usually it's database, and one image of your own. So like application or something. Then we go to the most interesting part of this thing. I want you work not only with us, but you work with each other. If possible, if you don't containerize some of your like proprietary project, please publish it on GitHub on your own repository. Then create a new issue at DataStaxDev Docker Learning Path issues. There is a special template for you to fill. Very simple, very short one. And I do hope you will do that. And I will try to help and review some of the projects there as well. Then finally, choose an issue from the list of the other issues, because you will be hopefully not the only one who publishes something. Write a comment on the issue, what you would like to review this one. Review the project. Think how you would review that. How you would improve that. Maybe there is something you would suggest. And write it as a comment to this issue. If you have time and if you have interest, feel free to review multiple projects. So you will have an overview of what people are doing with Docker and Docker Compose, and it will help you be better, but also you will see all how it works. Try to clone repositories of other people and make Docker Compose up and see how it works. Very important, feedback must be always done in a positive manner, and I take it very seriously. Next thing, if you want us to review your assignment publicly, send us the link using Discord or email or GitHub or whatever you prefer, and some of the best submissions we will cover next workshop, because next workshop is exactly going to be regarding the application development. And we really would like to have some assignments done like that. And finally, we spent together over 4 hours already, so add us on LinkedIn and Twitter and YouTube. And thank you for your questions. We are over time, so I will answer your questions in Discord. Thank you so much for being with us, and see you next week.
Yeah, thank you very much, and see you next week.